Good morning.
Morning.
How are you?
Good, thanks.
I don't think that we've told you yet what this part of the process is about. So you may have gleaned it from Mr. De Leon's questions, trying to find out what you sort of bring into the courtroom here today about the case, what we call pretrial publicity, but just to get a feel for your sort of predispositions one way or the other, or what information you have about it. So that's why we're going to ask you some more questions about that, okay?
Okay.
It sounds like the only place that you get your current events information from then is 104.1?
Yes.
Are there
In
any-
passing, like it's not like I don't watch it or listen to it religiously. It was just I just happened to be in the radio and it was on that day.
Okay. Any other sources at all that you keep up on those things that interest you?
Probably Yahoo.
I'm sorry?
Yahoo.
Okay. Just, so is that sort of your go-to then on the internet for any type of information?
Mhm.
Okay. And again, as he mentioned, we can understand you, but she has to, so if
I'm
you
sorry,
would,
yes.
that's okay. I do it a lot myself. Tell me what, if anything, you remember seeing or learning about this case from your viewing of Yahoo.
I didn't look at it on Yahoo. It's just that's where I get my news from pretty much. But when I look things up, it's mostly about like sports or frivolous.
Okay. Do you recall about when this happened, this event happened with George Zimmerman and Trayvon?
From what he said, it was last year, beginning of last year.
Okay. I'm asking
But
not
I
a
don't.
particular
I
date.
personally don't
No,
know. Yeah.
certainly not. But I was curious, do you remember whenever the date was that it happened?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Tell me what the first thing was that you remember, first event that sticks in your mind about this. What was that?
I remember hearing something about a African American male passing, and they had a suspect,
Okay.
and that was pretty much it. Like I didn't really have like any major details as far as that. I heard it one day, and then like I don't know, like a little bit of time had passed, and then there was more information.
Okay. The first little snippet that you heard, do you remember where you heard that?
That was probably from the radio.
Okay. And again, probably 104.1, not
Yes.
holding you to it, probably.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then the next time that you heard about it, what you said at first that there was a shooting and that they had a suspect.
Yes.
Had any information on who the suspect was?
Yes, they named him.
Okay.
And then they were speaking about like the gun laws and all that stuff. That's when like all the gun talk came into play. I believe it was still on the Phillips file that I heard it too.
Okay. And you had answered a question to Mr. De Leon that was that you heard that there was some racial tension because of it.
Mm-hmm.
Was that from the beginning, from the first time you heard about it, or when did that sort of fall upon you as being one of the elements of it?
About like the second or third time I heard about it on the radio, like there was a lot of like racial tension and buildup going on about that case.
Tell me what you knew about that racial tension.
I just knew it was a young African American male, and then in the beginning I heard it was a white male that killed him, as far as that went.
Okay.
And so like I guess that always gets like a lot of play because it's always, you know, if there's like a divide in like color, I guess.
Okay. Anything particular when you say racial tension, how did that sort of fall on you? What was it that presented itself to you as being a tense event because of the racial distinction?
Because they kept bringing it up. Like, I mean, if it was just like, you know, one person, you know, killing another, like they don't normally go into that much detail or emphasis as far as color goes. But this one, they happen to keep mentioning it often.
Okay. Did you pay any particular attention to it because of the racial overtones?
No.
And as you were going through it, then we now talked about the first couple of events, the very first time when you heard that there was a shooting, and then when you know that there was some ongoing coverage of it? Tell me, sort of as we're going through that path, what the next thing was that you became aware of.
That was pretty much it. Like, I just tried to like stay away from it, but I got the gist of it, and then I was like, okay, on to the next thing.
And was that an intentional decision to stay away from it?
Yes, on my part, yes.
Why?
Because I like I said before, I don't really like to get that involved as far as current events. It's just something that I do for myself.
Okay. Did you make any decision at that point that the racial overtones of it were justified or not justified?
No. Because I didn't know enough about it to go one way or another.
And then I think that you mentioned that one piece of physical evidence that you remember was a picture of Mr. Zimmerman, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And can you describe that again for me?
I'm assuming it was a mugshot because it just had him, it had the camera pointed straight at him, and there was bruising on his face.
Injuries on his face?
Yes, injuries.
Did that give you any pause and to consider what may have happened to him?
Like I said, I just assumed that there was a physical altercation between him and the victim.
From the media, did you glean any information that George Zimmerman may have done anything wrong?
No.
Similar question from that picture or anything else. Did you make any conclusion or thought that Trayvon Martin may have done anything wrong?
From that, no.
No?
It could have been like an accident, freak accident or whatever, but I didn't know enough about it to sway one way or the other. Do you go to church? No.
Have you in the past year and a half?
No.
Are there any other programs that you listen to at 104.1?
The Monsters in the Morning.
Okay.
It's like the morning radio station.
Yeah, I'm
Talk show.
familiar with it.
No.
Let's talk about Jim Files first. That is sort of your default, sometimes in the afternoon. I think he does the rush hour, you said?
Mm-hmm. Usually I'm in the car about that time, so if I'm in the car, I kind of switch back and forth between him and radio, like music.
From the exposure that you've had listening to him, what's his perspective on this case?
I think he was leaning more towards like murder instead of it being an accident.
And I'm sorry, I cut you off.
Oh no, I'm good. You're
Okay. And tell me what you remember, how that showed itself, Mr. Phillips' perspective. What did he say that you remember?
I remember him kind of being angry about how things went down as far as like all I remember him saying is that Mr. Martin went to go buy something from the gas station, and Mr. Zimmerman perceived him to be a threat, and so he got out of his car and started, I don't know, I guess harassing him. And so he thought like maybe he was racial profiling, and that's where I got the whole race thing from.
Mm-hmm. Did you find out any other information from him or from any other source that would contradict that?
No, I didn't go any further into it, so.
Anything else that Jim Phillips would have said about this case that you remember? Let me ask you this way. If I asked you to come up with 3 high points of listening to Jim Files, 3 high points of what he said, could be comment on evidence, could be just his own personal perspective, but 3 things that you remember Mr. Phillips saying about this case, what would they be?
Probably that it was an African American male versus a Caucasian male. That it was not really Mr. Zimmerman's place to, I guess, approach him. And then I can't really think of a third. I guess that Mr. Zimmerman was in the wrong. That's what he voiced his opinion about.
Do you recall Mr. Phillips ever commenting on particular pieces of evidence?
I remember there being a gun,
Okay.
but that was about it.
Do you
As far as
recall?
evidence,
Okay. Do you recall what he said about the gun
no,
or the use of the gun?
no.
Did you ever comment on any other parts of the case itself, like whether or not there was other evidence, be it audio evidence or video evidence or anything like that?
Not that I can remember.
Okay. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, the main purpose of this little inquiry is not just to test your memory as much as to get it out on the table, talk about it, because the real part of this inquiry is supposed to be this, and that is whatever you heard from any source, Mr. Phillips, Yahoo, or wherever, that's not evidence and
Right.
not to be considered evidence if you were to sit on the jury. Do you believe that different media outlets might have a certain bias or slant on how they present things?
Yes, that's
Mr.
why I don't
Phillips.
watch it. Yes.
I'm sorry?
Yes, that's why I try to stay clear of news and media, because everybody, even though they try and, like, I guess convey the truth or whatever, like everybody has their own spin on it or their own perception of what happened. So
And I think you acknowledged, as most people would, that Mr. Phillips certainly has a point of view on most things he talks about,
yes,
and that it may not be agreed to by everybody, and that's part of the reason why he says it.
correct.
To the extent that you have heard that information from him or any other source, how would you handle it if you sat on the jury, listened to all the evidence, and evidence that you heard conflicted with what you remember hearing from Mr. Phillips?
As my understanding, like, I'm not supposed to, like, use what I heard prior to being on the jury as to sway my opinion one way or another. Like, it's just supposed to be what happens in here.
Okay.
So it wouldn't make a difference to me.
So which one then would you default to, that which you heard in the courtroom from the witness stand, or what you remember from Phillips or somebody else?
Whatever I heard in the courtroom would be what I base it upon.
And if, in the same sense, another juror tried to bring in information from outside the courtroom in deliberations, like, I remember hearing about this, but never showed up on the witness stand, but I'm certain I heard about it, how would you handle that problem?
I don't know, like, how I'm supposed to handle it, but I wouldn't take any of that into consideration if it was just coming from, like, outside the courtroom.
And that's the right answer. There's not any particular right answer. One woman said she'd call it a bailiff, or a deputy. That's a pretty good answer too. Just, I guess the point being that you would only consider and allow the rest of the jury to consider that which you heard from within the courtroom walls. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. When you received the jury summons, did you speak to anybody about it?
I remember posting a picture of it on Facebook and saying, not again. But other than that, like, I mentioned it to my mother.
Okay. And what was the purpose in putting your summons on Facebook?
It was just something to do.
Okay. And when you say not again, have you served before?
Well, I was summoned before, but I never made it to the courtroom.
And how long ago was that?
A couple of years ago. In a different county.
Have you lived in Seminole County long?
No, it's been about 8 months, maybe.
You luckily got to the top of the list pretty quickly then.
Yay.
In any of the information that you heard from the Phillips file or anywhere else, was the concept of self-defense discussed?
I think that was thrown around once or twice, yes.
Tell me about what you heard about that.
I heard that there was an altercation and that Mr. Zimmerman felt his life was in danger, so he decided to defend himself from Mr. Martin.
Do you know whether or not that information came from Jim Phillips?
Not that I can recall. I don't remember where I heard it from.
Okay. And I think you said that you told your mom about the summons?
Yes.
At that point, did you know that it might be for the Zimmerman case?
No.
At some point, did you realize that it might be for the Zimmerman case?
Yes.
When was that?
Talked about it a little bit more, and it was right before I had to go on vacation, and then she mentioned that they were doing the jury selection for his case, and then I found out it was a need.
Okay. What were the conversations you had with your mom about that?
It was just in passing, like we try and communicate at least every couple of days about everything, so it was just maybe like a 5-minute conversation.
Okay. Did she have a reaction that you might be sitting on the Zimmerman case?
No.
And from your view or just exposure to the media, did you hear any information about either George Zimmerman's background or Trayvon Martin's background?
No.
And that included comments from Phillips, nothing from him about any of those?
No.
When I started, and also when Mr. DeLeon started, we talked about this just being a process to try and find out what you have in your memory banks so that we know about it. Anything that either I've talked about or that you've thought about since Mr. DeLeon asked the questions about media exposure, or what we call pretrial publicity, that we haven't covered? Anything else that you sort of popped in your mind? You remember seeing this picture or hearing this on TV or on Yahoo, anything like that?
No.
Okay. You just have 1 minute, Your Honor. Just a couple more questions. I know you said you talked to your mom about at least serving on the jury, that you stay in touch with her. In those conversations, has she formed an opinion at all or any insight on her thoughts on this case?
No.
Ever talked to her about it at all?
No.
Okay. And to summarize, your main information about this case is from the Phillips file, or 104, or more generally, and maybe a touch from Yahoo,
Yeah.
no other sources from internet. Any discussions with any family, other family besides your mom?
No.
And any discussion with any friends,
No.
even after you got the summons?
Correct.
Okay. Great. Thanks so much for the time. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. If you'll remain seated and counsel approach when you're ready.
said it was last year, beginning of last year.
Okay. I'm asking
But
not
I
a
don't,
particular
I
date.
personally don't
No,
know. Yeah.
certainly not. But I was curious, do you remember whenever the date was that it happened?
Mhm. Yes.
Okay. Tell me what the first thing was that you remember, first event that sticks in your mind about this. What was that?
I remember hearing something about a African American male passing, and they had I guess, a suspect,
Okay.
and that was.
It sounds like the only place that you get your current events information from then is 104.1?
Yes.
Are there
In
any-
passing, like it's not like I don't watch it or listen to it religiously. It's just I just happened to be in the radio and it was on that day.
Okay. Any other sources at all that you keep up on those things that interest you?
Probably Yahoo.
I'm sorry?
Yahoo.
Okay. Just, so is that sort of your go-to then on the internet for any type of information?
Mhm.
Okay. And again, as he mentioned, we can understand you, but she has to, so if
I'm
you
sorry,
would,
yes.
that's okay. I do it a lot myself. Tell me what, if anything, you remember seeing or learning about this case from your viewing of Yahoo.
I didn't look at it on Yahoo. It's just that's where I get my news from, pretty much. But when I look things up, it's mostly about like sports or frivolous things.
Okay. Do you recall about when this happened, this event happened with George Zimmerman and Trayvon?
From what he's pretty much it. Like I didn't really have like any major details as far as that. I heard it one day, and then like I don't know, like a little bit of time had passed, and then there was more information.
Okay. The first little snippet that you heard, do you remember where you heard that?
That was probably from the radio.
Okay. And again, probably 104.1, not
Yes.
holding you to it, probably.
Mhm. Yes.
And then the next time that you heard about it, what you said at first that there was a shooting and that they had a suspect.
Yes.
But any information on who the suspect was? Good morning.
Morning.
How are you?
Good, thanks.
I don't think that we've told you yet what this part of the process is about. So you may have gleaned it from Mr. De Leon's questions, trying to find out what you sort of bring into the courtroom here today about the case, what we call pretrial publicity, but just to get a feel for your sort of predispositions one way or the other, or what information you have about it. So that's why we're going to ask you some more questions about that, okay?
Okay.